Imagine a house so feared that even its ruins were whispered about for decades after they were gone. A house the press called the most haunted in England. A place where priests fled, servants wept, and investigators lost their grip on reality. That house was Borley Rectory. It began in 1862 when Reverend Henry Bull decided to build a rectory in the sleepy Essex village of Borley. On the surface, nothing seemed strange. The village was small, quiet, surrounded by mist-drenched fields. But the land he chose was different. Locals said it was cursed ground. Whispers told of a monastery that had stood there centuries earlier. A nun, they said, had fallen in love with a monk. The two tried to flee together, but they were captured. The monk was executed. The nun's punishment was worse. She was bricked alive inside the convent walls, left to die in silence. The ground was consecrated by death. And when Reverend Bull built his house upon it, Borley Rectory was doomed from its very first stone. The Bull family moved in, and soon after, strange figures began to appear on the grounds. Villagers spoke of a pale nun, drifting silently along a garden path, her face hidden beneath a black veil. She was seen so often the path became known as the Nun's Walk. At first, Henry Bull dismissed it as imagination, but his children spoke of hearing bells in the dead of night, bells that rang when no church tower stirred. Servants reported footsteps pacing in empty hallways, and shadows, tall and thin, stretched across the windows even when no one stood. Outside, it wasn't just a house, it was a stage, and the actors were not always alive. Over time, the villagers learned to keep their distance. They avoided the rectory at dusk, crossing the road rather than walk past its gates. Stories spread, doors slamming on their own, whispers in the cellar, the sound of horses and wheels echoing where no carriage had passed. The Bulls endured it. They had little choice, but the family grew marked by unease. Faith gave way to fear, and fear to resignation. For nearly 70 years, Borley Rectory became a legend whispered about but rarely entered. And by the time the 1930s arrived, the house was waiting, patiently, hungrily, for its next victims. Before we step further into Borley's shadows, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Tell us in the comments. I always want to know how far these mysteries reach. And if this story already has you hooked, then subscribe to Cold Mysteries. Here, every week we open the doors to a place history tried to bury. Now, back to Borley. By the time Reverend Lionel Foyster and his young wife Marianne moved into Borley Rectory in the 1930s, the house's reputation was already infamous. They had been warned, they had been told the stories, but nothing could prepare them for what awaited. The ghosts of Borley had grown restless. They would not just walk corridors or whisper in cellars. They would attack, they would terrify, they would write messages on the very walls, and they would drive the people inside to the edge of madness. Before the Foysters, before Harry Price and the headlines, Borley Rectory was already alive with whispers. The Bull family, Reverend Henry Bull, his wife, and their many children were the first to understand that this was no ordinary home. And their story is where the haunting truly begins. In the late 19th century, Borley Village was a place where time moved slowly. Farmers tended their fields, bells rang for church on Sundays, and gossip travelled quicker than the carriages. But the talk that spread about the rectory was different. The Bull children, while playing in the gardens, claimed to see a spectral nun gliding along the gravel path, her face hidden in shadow. At first, Reverend Bull scolded them for superstition, yet one evening as he stood at his study window, even he admitted to seeing her, silent, unwavering, and impossibly real. That path became known as the Nun's Walk. Villagers began to whisper prayers when they passed, clutching rosaries as if to shield themselves from whatever walked beside them. Inside the rectory, life grew more unsettled. Servants awoke to the sound of footsteps pacing the corridors at night. But when they opened their doors, the hallways were empty. Doors opened and closed as if by unseen hands. A maid carrying a tray swore she felt someone brush past her, on the stairs, though no one was there. The bulls tried to explain it away. Old houses creak, winds stir, imagination plays cruel tricks. Yet their unease deepened as the incidents mounted. One daughter swore she heard whispered voices calling her name from the cellar. Another fainted after glimpsing a figure staring through the window. Though the glass opened onto a sheer drop, impossible for anyone living to stand there. Unlike harmless whispers, Borley's poltergeist activity carried menace. One evening, a mirror shattered in Reverend Bull's study, sending shards across the room. On another night, the bells, silent for years, began to ring all at once, clanging as if unseen hands pulled every rope together. The family huddled in terror, their prayers drowned by the noise. Yet when they opened the bell tower, the next morning, the ropes were neatly tied, undisturbed. Even the bravest servants could endure no more. Many left without notice, refusing to step foot in the house again. Villagers began avoiding the rectory after dark, saying the place belonged not to God, but to something far older. For Reverend Bull, the haunting created a terrible conflict. As a man of the church, he was bound to faith, reason, and the power of prayer. But as a father, he could not deny the fear etched on his children's faces. He wrote little of it publicly, perhaps out of pride, perhaps fear of ridicule. But within the family, the stories grew darker. One child claimed to see the nun beckoning from the garden. Another swore that when he looked too long into her face, it changed into a grinning skull. By the turn of the century, Borley Rectory had earned its reputation. It was no longer just a house where odd things happened. It was a house that seemed to breathe, to wait, to hunger. The bulls endured, their faith steady, though their nerves frayed. But time has a way of turning legends into something much darker. For when the Foyster family arrived in 1930, Borley Rectory would no longer be content with shadows, whispers, or the quiet terror of a nun drifting through the garden. It would strike, it would scream, and it would leave marks on the walls themselves, as if the house had found a voice at last. When Reverend Lionel Foyster and his young wife Marianne moved into Borley Rectory in 1930, they believed they were taking on nothing more than a large, if slightly eerie, parish home. But within weeks it became clear that Borley had been waiting for them. And unlike the Bulls, the Foysters would face a haunting so violent, so personal, it would nearly destroy them. Lionel Foyster, scholarly and devout, brought Marianne to Borley with hopes of a quiet parish life. She was young, spirited, eager to begin her role as a rector's wife. The house, though weathered, seemed manageable. At first, only small disturbances unsettled them. Footsteps at night, faint knocks on doors. Lionel dismissed it as the house settling. Marianne laughed it off. But Borley Rectory has a way of testing resolve, and soon laughter turned to screams. Their calm evenings were shattered by sudden crashes, stones hurled across rooms by unseen hands. Windows shattered without cause. Books leapt from shelves. A jug of milk, untouched, slid across the dining table and smashed on the floor. Most terrifying of all, objects did not just move, they targeted. Stones struck Lionel's shoulder. A candlestick narrowly missed Marianne's head. The house was not merely restless, it was hostile. Marianne, more than anyone, bore the brunt of the haunting. She was thrown from her bed by invisible hands. Doors slammed against her as she passed. Once, she was locked inside a room for hours, though the key had not been turned. But the worst was yet to come. For Borley Rectory found a way to speak directly to her. One evening, Lionel discovered faint scrawls across the wallpaper of an upstairs corridor. They were crude, shaky words, but their meaning was undeniable. "Marianne, please help me." Over the weeks, more appeared. "Please." Cries for release. But soon, the messages turned darker. "Marianne, don't leave. Marianne, you are mine." It was as if the house itself had chosen her as its victim, binding her name to its endless torment. Lionel tried to fight back. He held exorcisms, reciting scripture as the walls groaned and objects flew across the room. At times, he thought he had succeeded. The house would grow silent, still, almost calm. But the quiet never lasted. Each time, the activity returned stronger, as if mocking his faith. Neighbors whispered that Marianne was cursed. Some suggested she was fabricating the events. But when visitors saw stones fly across the room with their own eyes, the accusations faded. What remained was confusion. Was Marianne haunted by restless spirits, or targeted by something far worse? By 1935, the Foysters were broken. Lionel's health collapsed under the strain. Marianne, pale and hollow-eyed, lived in terror of what each day might bring. Servants fled, parishioners avoided the rectory altogether, and finally, the Foysters themselves had no choice. They abandoned Borley Rectory, leaving behind not just a house, but a battlefield. For the torment they endured would draw more than whispers. It would draw attention. And in the years to come, Borley Rectory would no longer be the concern of frightened villagers or weary priests. It would become the obsession of investigators, journalists, and skeptics across England. And one man above. All others would claim it as his stage, Harry Price. By the time the Foysters fled Borley Rectory in 1935, its reputation had spread far beyond the quiet lanes of Essex. Newspapers had already branded it the most haunted house in England. And where there are headlines, there are investigators. Some came armed with cameras, some with Bibles, others with nothing more than skepticism and a pen. But one man would eclipse them all: Harry Price. Harry Price was no ordinary ghost hunter. He was a master of spectacle, tall, impeccably dressed, with a booming voice and a flair for the dramatic. To some, he was the Sherlock Holmes of the supernatural. To others, he was a fraud, a conjurer, a manipulator of gullible believers. But when he heard of Borley Rectory, he knew he had found the perfect stage. The press, hungry for stories of terror, followed his every move, and Price made sure there was always something to write about. In the years following the Foysters' departure, Price rented the rectory and installed his own team of observers. They were instructed to record every knock, every shadow, every inexplicable event. Visitors reported bells ringing from empty towers, cold drafts sweeping through sealed rooms. And once, the most chilling of all, a figure in black gliding through the courtyard, her face hidden beneath a veil. The nun had returned. Price claimed to have documented countless incidents, more than enough to fill books which he later published to great acclaim. But with every story of terror, doubt followed close behind. Critics accused Price of staging phenomena for fame. They pointed out that he had a background in conjuring and illusion. Could the flying stones, the ringing bells, the shadowy figures have been nothing more than carefully planted tricks? The debate was fierce. Skeptics tore into Price's reports, claiming exaggeration and deception. Believers defended him, pointing to the sheer number of witnesses. How could so many have been fooled, they argued, unless something truly unexplainable lurked within those walls? As the controversy grew, so did Borley's legend. The rectory was no longer just a haunted house. It was a battleground between science and superstition, faith and fraud. Reporters swarmed the grounds, tourists travelled from across England to glimpse the cursed building. And for every skeptic who dismissed it as theatrics, there was another who swore they felt unseen eyes watching them from the windows. What cannot be denied is this: those who stayed at Borley, even briefly, often left changed. hardened journalists, admitted to sleepless nights. Investigators confessed to hearing whispers they could not explain, and Price himself, though ever the showman, spoke of Borley with a peculiar gravity. He once told a colleague, "The house resents us. It knows we are here, and it does not want to be studied." Whether manipulation or madness, the effect was the same. Borley Rectory's power grew with every passing year, feeding on belief, fear, and attention, and it was far from finished. For while Price was building a legend, Marianne Foyster, the house's most tormented victim, was still haunted, and Borley was not done with her. Of all the souls touched by Borley Rectory, none were marked more deeply than Marianne Foyster. Long after she and her husband Lionel fled the house, the haunting clung to her like smoke. Wherever she went, the whispers followed, and though critics accused her of trickery, her torment felt far too real to those who witnessed it. Because at Borley, the walls themselves seemed to want her. It began as faint scratches, almost like chalk smudges across the faded wallpaper. At first, Marianne dismissed them as childish vandalism, but when the words formed into sentences, she could no longer deny it. "Marianne, please help me." Over time, the messages multiplied. They pleaded, begged, shifted in tone. Some sounded desperate, sorrowful. Others dripped with malice. "Marianne, don't leave. Marianne, you are mine." The letters scrawled themselves higher and higher up the walls, as if some unseen hand stretched to leave its mark. Visitors swore they saw the words appear before their very eyes, thin scratches deepening into legible script, as though the plaster itself had become a page for the dead. Marianne was increasingly isolated, servants left in fear. Parishioners whispered about her behind closed doors. Neighbors accused her of bringing the curse upon the rectory. Even Lionel, weary from years of spiritual battle, began to doubt. Was Marianne a victim, or the source? Doctors suggested hysteria. Skeptics accused her of fabricating events for attention. Yet none of them could explain the chilling consistency of the writings, nor the witnesses who claimed to hear Marianne's name whispered in empty rooms. The psychological toll was immense. Marianne became withdrawn, haunted not just by spirits, but by suspicion. Wherever Marianne went within the rectory, the activity seemed to follow. Stones were hurled at her head, doors slammed in her path, windows shattered as she passed, and once, in a moment that terrified even hardened investigators, she was lifted and thrown bodily across a room, landing hard on the floor. It was as if the house, or whatever inhabited it, had chosen her as its obsession, its victim, its prize. History still debates Marianne's role at Borley. Was she truly haunted? Was she the unconscious cause of the poltergeist activity, her mind projecting its turmoil onto the world around her? Or was she, as some have argued, a trickster who wove lies into legend? The truth is tangled in shadow. But what cannot be denied is the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion in her voice, the accounts of those who lived beside her and swore they saw what she endured. And in the end, whether spirit, fraud, or psychological projection, the torment was real, and it nearly destroyed her. By 1935, Marianne's writings had shifted once more. No longer mere pleas or demands, they hinted at something ancient and malignant. It will burn. We will not leave. They were no longer addressed to her. They were declarations, prophecies, and in time those words would come true. For Borley Rectory was destined to burn, and in its flames it would reveal secrets no one was ready to face. By the mid-1930s, Borley Rectory had become more than a haunted house. It was a stage, and Harry Price was its director. He had filled newspapers with tales of flying stones and phantom nuns, but now he wanted more. He wanted contact, proof, a voice from beyond. And so, Borley became the setting for seances that would shake even hardened skeptics. Price invited spiritualists and mediums from across England. They gathered in candlelit rooms, their hands linked, their breaths shallow, waiting for the house to speak. It didn't take long. Tables shuddered, candles flickered violently. One medium, in a trance, whispered a story that chilled all who listened. A nun, bricked alive centuries earlier for her forbidden love, still wandered the grounds, bound in suffering. The group reported that she begged for prayers, for release from her torment. But not all the voices were gentle. Another medium gasped, clutching her throat, and claimed a darker spirit stalked the house, something cruel, something that delighted in fear. Price's investigators recorded pages of transcripts. Spirits allegedly spoke of murders, of bodies, buried beneath the rectory. One chilling message warned, the house will be destroyed by fire. Secrets will be revealed in the ruins. The prediction unsettled even Price, who normally dismissed such melodrama. But the words lingered, written in the margins of his reports like a curse waiting to unfold. The seances also sparked a search for the rectory's secrets. For decades, rumors had swirled of hidden passages and bricked-up chambers beneath the house. Servants spoke of locked doors that led nowhere, of sudden cold spots along the cellar walls. Investigators tapped along the foundations, listening for hollow echoes. Some claimed they found spaces sealed long ago, places that might conceal skeletons, relics, or worse, but the deeper they searched, the more the house resisted. Tools went missing, doors slammed shut on their own, and always that chilling sense that unseen eyes were watching, waiting, mocking their intrusion. Not everyone believed. Local clergy condemned the seances as blasphemy, accusing Price of exploiting fear for fame. Scholars scoffed at his notes, calling them theatrics designed for gullible readers. But even the skeptics admitted that something about Borley was wrong. The air too heavy, the shadows too deep, the atmosphere too charged with dread. And for every critic who called Price a fraud, there were those who swore they saw what he recorded. The flicker of figures in empty corridors, the sound of voices echoing from nowhere. The seances ended, but their warnings did not fade. Again and again, mediums repeated the same prophecy. The rectory will burn. And when it does, the dead will speak through the ashes. Price recorded it carefully, though he never admitted whether he believed it, but the house, it seemed, had already chosen its ending. And in 1939, that prophecy would come true. Flames would devour Borley Rectory, and in the fire, the legend would only grow stronger. The seance warnings had been clear. The house will be destroyed by fire. Secrets will be revealed in the ruins. And in February of 1939, Borley Rectory obeyed its own prophecy. The rectory, by then largely abandoned, was being rented by a Captain W.H. Gregson. On a cold winter night, he accidentally knocked over an oil lamp in the hallway. Within minutes, flames licked across the wood-paneled walls, feeding hungrily on the dry beams of the aging structure. Neighbors rushed to help, but the fire spread too quickly. Soon the entire house was engulfed. The sky above Essex lit orange with its fury. Villagers gathered at a distance, their faces pale, watching the legend burn alive before their eyes. Yet it wasn't just fire they claimed to see. Witnesses swore that amid the smoke, ghostly figures appeared at the windows. Pale faces, shadowed forms, a veiled nun staring down as if trapped in the blaze. Some insisted they heard screams that did not belong to any living person. Others claimed the toll of phantom bells rang through the night, though the rectory's tower had long been silent. To the villagers, it was confirmation. Borley Rectory was not destroyed by accident. It was consumed by the very spirits that had haunted it for decades. When dawn came, only blackened walls and a gutted shell remained. The most haunted house in England was reduced to ruins, its twisted beams jutting like broken bones against the sky. But even in death, Borley refused to rest. Investigators combing the remains found chilling remnants, scraps of scorched wallpaper still marked with faint messages, fragments of scorched furniture, and most disturbingly, bones buried in the rubble. During excavation of the ruined cellar, workers uncovered skeletal remains. Some claimed they were animal, others swore they were human, the fragile bones of a woman. Mediums immediately connected the discovery to the nun of legend, the one said to have been bricked alive centuries earlier. To believers, the fire had released her at last. To skeptics, it was nothing more than coincidence, bones mistakenly identified or deliberately planted. But the damage was done. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Borley Rectory had burned, and in its ashes its legend had only grown stronger. Harry Price wasted no time. He visited the ruins, documenting every charred corner, every scorched relic. He wrote of the fire as if it were the final act of a grand performance, a stage curtain falling on England's greatest ghost story. Yet even Price, ever the showman, seemed shaken. He wrote in his notes, "The house did not simply burn, it died, and in its death throes it revealed something we are not meant to understand." The ruins became a site of pilgrimage. Ghost hunters, tourists, skeptics all came to stand among the ashes, hoping to glimpse what remained. Many claimed they felt watched, that the silence itself seemed unnatural, and some swore that even in ruins, the house whispered. The fire had ended Borley Rectory as a building, but as a legend, it was more alive than ever. The spirits had promised their secrets would emerge in the flames, and now bones, whispers, and unanswered questions lay scattered in the ashes. But Borley's story was far from finished, because Harry Price, ever ambitious, ever determined, would return to the ruins, and his final investigations would transform Borley Rectory from a local haunting into one of the most enduring mysteries in history. The fire had reduced Borley Rectory to a blackened skeleton, but to Harry Price, it was not the end. It was an opportunity. For Price, the ruins were not just ashes. They were evidence. And in those charred remains, he sought to prove once and for all that Borley had been more than myth. In the years following the fire, Price organized what would become his most famous investigation. He gathered a team of researchers, students, and volunteers, carefully chosen to document every unexplained occurrence at the site. They carried notebooks, thermometers, and cameras. This was not just ghost hunting. It was, as Price declared, scientific inquiry into the survival of the human spirit. The ruins were combed night after night. Observers recorded strange lights flickering among the blackened beams, phantom footsteps pacing across scorched floors, and whispers that seemed to rise from the earth itself. And always, in the distance, the shadow of a veiled nun, watching. Price compiled his findings into books that electrified the public: The Most Haunted House in England, and later, The End of Borley Rectory. In them, he claimed the evidence was overwhelming. Borley had been a site of genuine supernatural activity. The writings on the walls, the apparitions, the fire, all connected, all part of a haunting unlike any other. Readers were enthralled. The press amplified every revelation. Borley Rectory was no longer just a curiosity. It was a national obsession, a story told in parlours, pubs, and classrooms across Britain. But fame comes at a cost. Skeptics struck back, dissecting Price's reports with brutal precision. Magicians pointed to his background in conjuring, claiming he could easily have faked the phenomena he described. Scholars accused him of exaggeration, of encouraging witnesses to see what they wanted to see. Some even suggested he staged incidents outright, ringing bells himself, planting messages on the walls. To them, Borley was not a haunting, it was theatre. And Harry Price was its playwright. Yet for every skeptic, there was a believer. Witnesses who had seen the nun with their own eyes swore Price had only recorded the truth. Parishioners who had fled in terror defended Marianne Foyster's experiences. Even hardened journalists admitted they felt an unnatural dread at Borley's ruins. The debate was vicious, unending. Fraud versus fact, illusion versus evidence. And in that clash, Borley's legend only grew stronger. Because whether one believed or not, the story demanded attention. In 1948, Harry Price died suddenly of a heart attack at his home in Polborough. To his admirers, it was a devastating loss. To his critics, it was the quiet end of a loud career. But Price had left behind more than books. He left behind questions, thousands of pages of notes, reports, and eyewitness accounts that no skeptic could fully erase. And with his death, Borley itself seemed to grow quieter, as if the house's greatest performer had taken its energy with him. Yet even in ruins, Borley refused to fade. Visitors to the site continued to report strange phenomena. Farmers working nearby spoke of ghostly figures drifting among the rubble. Travelers swore they saw a nun vanish into the mist along the road. The house was gone, but the haunting lived on, and the debate that Price had stoked, fraud or fact, hysteria or haunting, would outlive him, echoing through decades of ghost stories and paranormal research. Because once a house is branded the most haunted in England, it never truly dies. Borley Rectory was gone, burned, reduced to rubble, nothing more than blackened brick and scorched timbers, and yet the house refused to die. Its legend lingered, feeding on memory, belief, and fear. What began as whispers in a small Essex village grew into one of the most enduring hauntings in history. After the fire, the skeletal remains of Borley became a kind of shrine. Paranormal investigators, curious travelers, and thrill-seekers all made pilgrimages to the site. Some came with notebooks and cameras, others came with nothing but nerves and whispered prayers. Even stripped of walls and windows, the place radiated dread. Visitors spoke of sudden chills, of being watched, of hearing faint footsteps pacing across ash where floors no longer existed. One local farmer claimed he refused to cut across the land at night, insisting he saw a black-veiled figure drift through the ruins, vanishing into mist. Another swore he heard bells tolling in the early hours, the sound of a tower that had not stood for years. The people of Borley village were torn. Some insisted the haunting had been exaggerated, that Price and the newspapers had inflated a few odd events into a circus, but others defended the stories, pointing to decades of witnesses who could not all have been deceived. They spoke of servants too terrified to stay, of neighbours who heard voices on quiet nights, of Marianne Foyster's torment. The rectory might have been reduced to rubble, but the village carried its shadow still. Children were warned to stay away. Older residents avoided speaking of it after dark, as if words alone might summon the past back into being. Borley also drew the attention of academics and psychologists. To some, it was a case study in mass hysteria, a village and a nation caught in the grip of suggestion, where belief itself created reality. They argued that Marianne's writings on the walls were born of subconscious projection, that Harry Price's investigators saw what they expected to see, that the entire legend was a mirror reflecting the fears of those who entered the house rather than spirits within. But even the most skeptical studies could not erase the sheer volume of testimony. Too many witnesses, too many consistent reports, too many details matching across decades. Fraud could explain some, madness could explain others, but all? That remained a question unanswered. Even into the 1960s and beyond, long after Borley's remains were finally cleared, stories continued. Travelers passing through the village reported glimpsing a nun gliding along the roadside at dusk. Hikers spoke of whispers carried on the wind. And in the post office that now stands near the site, workers quietly admitted to uneasy feelings. Cold drafts, fleeting shadows, the sense that the rectory's ghosts had not vanished, only shifted. Borley Rectory is gone. The land where it stood is silent. But legends do not need bricks and mortar to survive. They live in memory, in story, in fear. And Borley's story remains one of the most chilling in English history, not because of proof, not because of science, but because of doubt. Because no matter how many times skeptics try to explain it away, there will always be those who swear they saw the nun's veiled face, who heard the bells ring, who read words on the walls begging for help. And it is that uncertainty, that eternal what if, that keeps Borley alive. Borley Rectory no longer stands. Its bricks lie scattered, its timbers rotted, its foundations buried beneath the quiet soil of Essex, and yet its shadow endures. Not in the walls, but in the minds of all who dare to remember it. For more than 70 years, Borley Rectory raised questions that no investigator could answer. Were the hauntings real? The restless nun, the flying stones, the voices that scratched Marianne's name into the walls? Or were they illusions, the fevered imaginations of a family trapped in isolation, a village eager for gossip, a showman hungry for fame? Harry Price claimed he had proof. Skeptics claimed he was a fraud. Marianne herself claimed she was a victim. And yet, every side left gaps, shadows, questions no one could silence. In the end, perhaps Borley's greatest mystery is not whether it was haunted, but why it still haunts us. Because Borley Rectory is not just a house, it is a mirror. For believers, it reflects the certainty that the dead linger among us, restless, aching to be heard. For skeptics, it reflects the dangers of deception, hysteria, and manipulation. But for all who hear its story, it reflects something deeper: the power of belief itself. Once enough people whisper the same story, once enough eyes swear they've seen the same shadow, once enough hearts race at the same sound in the dark, the line between truth and legend dissolves. Borley remains the most famous haunted house in England, not because of what was proved, but because of what was never disproved. Every unanswered question, every conflicting account, every lingering doubt adds another brick to the ghostly house that still stands in imagination, stronger than stone, more enduring than fire. And perhaps that is why even today, travelers who pass through Borley pause at the roadside. They lower their voices. Some glance toward the empty land where the rectory once stood, and in their silence they admit what they cannot explain, that some places refuse to be forgotten. So tell me, what do you believe? Was Borley Rectory truly haunted, cursed by a nun's sorrow and a house's hunger? Or was it the greatest ghost story ever staged? Share your thoughts below and let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. And if these shadows have stayed with you, then subscribe to Cold Mysteries, because every week we walk together into history's darkest corners, unlocking doors that were meant to stay closed. Just remember, not all doors lead back out, and some never let go.